Hello, and welcome to the R2 2016 release webinar for Telerik DevCraft. My name is John Bristow, and I'd like to thank you for joining us to hear about the exciting new features we've shipped in our latest release. We really appreciate it. I'm joined by Sam Basu and Ed Charbonneau of the Developer Relations team at Telerik. Our job is to connect with customers and show them what's possible with Telerik solutions. In this webinar, Sam, Ed, and I will walk you through updates we've made to the products that make up Telerik DevCraft. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that all the bits that we'll be showing you here are available online, so make sure to fire up the Telerik control panel to download the latest updates. Now, I know it can be tough to sit through an entire webinar. It's easy to get distracted or pulled away from your desk. If that happens, don't worry. This webinar is being recorded and will be available up on YouTube. Finally, if you're experiencing any audio or video difficulties, fire up that Q&A panel and ask for help. Speaking of questions, we have prizes available for folks in the US who ask the best ones. We'll be giving away a couple of Mayo gesture control armbands for the best questions asked during this webinar. These armbands are insanely cool. You'll definitely want one. So make sure to fire up the Q&A panel and send us those questions. Also make sure to stick around until the end of this webinar where we'll review and answer the questions you asked during this presentation. And if you don't like asking questions, that's okay too. We have a pair of IceOrb levitating speakers to give away to 2 random webinar attendees. If an armband isn't your thing, then maybe this device will do. It's also worth noting that we'll be posting a recap of this webinar, including the prize winners, and a summary of your questions up on the Telerik Developer Network at developer.telerik.com. Okay, so we're here to show you everything that we've shipped in Telerik DevCraft for the R2 2016 release. Telerik DevCraft is our collection of UI controls and products to help you build web, desktop, and mobile applications. It comes in 3 editions: UI, Complete, and Ultimate, each of which is underpinned by our world-class support and maintenance. It's an amazing value. Looking back, we've had a pretty consistent cadence over the past number of years. To simplify our releases, Telerik DevCraft ships 3 times per year. We ship service packs and previews during this time as well. Recently, we've renamed our major releases, but our goal of quality and consistent releases remains unchanged. Like previous releases of Telerik DevCraft, the R2 2016 release is full of exciting features in its product lineup. Now, we don't have time to cover each and every one. However, we have published detailed blog posts on each of them at blogs.telerik.com. So, to kick things off, I'd like to invite Ed Charbonneau to tell us about the latest innovations we've added to 2 products, UI for ASP.NET AJAX and UI for ASP.NET MVC. Ed, the floor is yours.
All right, John, thanks for the awesome introduction. Let's kick things off with UI for ASP.NET AJAX. Our ASP.NET WebForms control suite comes packed with over 80 controls, all of which put you in complete control with robust server-side and client-side APIs. With every release of UI for ASP.NET AJAX, we give you something new to talk about, and this version is no different. There's a lot to be excited about. We've added a quick and easy print button for grids. The new material design theme is on point with some extra fit and finish. And the spreadsheet control received several noteworthy updates as well. The rad grid now offers improved resizing performance and optimized performance when the rating control is used in a virtualized grid. In addition, we've added a new built-in print button. Let's jump over to a demo and see how that works. The demos I'll be showing for Telerik UI for ASP.NET AJAX can be installed on your machine using the Telerik control panel. When you're updating your components, just click Proceed and make sure you check the local demos box before continuing on. This will install the demos that you see on our website locally on your machine so you can edit them in Visual Studio. So here I have the print button demo. As you can see, I have a grid with several items selected, and I'm just going to go up in the corner here and print this rad grid. We get a nice preview that includes all of the selected rows that we had, and we can send this straight out to the printer. To enable this feature on your grid, just set the client settings Enable Client Print Value to True. We've also updated the theme builder. Theme Builder now enables you to style controls that were previously missing, including Cloud Upload, Gantt, Media Player, Lightbox, Spreadsheet, Wizard, and more. The Theme Builder also got more powerful. Now you can create and customize themes based on the material skin, which also has the new ripple effect that you can see here. We've also continued to improve on our new spreadsheet control, which got several new features in this release. Let's take a look at some of those. So back over to the demos, I have the spreadsheet control open, so we can look at different skins on the spreadsheet. If you want to explore multiple skins, just drop down this drop-down box on the demo site and choose from any of the skins that are included with ASP.NET AJAX. I'm going to choose the material theme. When this reloads, you can see that we have the material theme applied to the spreadsheet, and it even includes those nice ripple effects that I talked about earlier. Next, let's look at a feature that many of you were asking for, and that's the ability to import to the spreadsheet control from the client using an Excel file. Now notice I have a spreadsheet control here with a button at the top that says Import from Excel file. I'm going to click this button, and I'm going to select a spreadsheet that I have here on my drive. And when I hit open, notice my spreadsheet's loaded in the spreadsheet control. Now to do this, we only needed a simple little bit of JavaScript. And the most important part of the JavaScript is this one line here. What this line does is it takes the spreadsheet control and it calls the from file method, passing the file that we received from the client. And that's all you need to load the file straight from the client's drive. Another feature that many of you asked for was the ability to enable and disable cells on the spreadsheet using the API. In this demo, we have a spreadsheet control with a checkbox up at the top that says Disable Product Column. And right now it's unchecked, so I can go in here and I can edit these items in the column. Now, if I go back up and check this box, I can no longer make changes to the items that are in this column. I can uncheck that again, and that will re-enable the column. So how did we do this? Just a quick API call from JavaScript. We get the range of the items in the spreadsheet that we want to enable and disable, and we just call the set enable method and pass in true or false. So if you're ready to take advantage of these new features, log into your Telerik control panel and download the updates. Next up, we'll be looking at Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC. Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC consists of 70+ controls, all powered by Kendo UI. Kendo UI provides feature-rich UIs rendered with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that work seamlessly on any screen size with responsive and adaptive rendering. You also get full control of the user experience with robust client-side APIs. But with UI for MVC, you get more than that. You get server-side rendering using Razor helpers, which means you have full IntelliSense, and Visual Studio scaffolding to boost productivity. So let's take a look at what's new. We have some great additions in this release of Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC. There's an all-new Quick Start guide that will get you familiar with building responsive applications using Telerik. We've added a brand new scaffolding wizard for creating tree views, and we're pushing ahead with support for ASP.NET Core Razor tag helpers. So let's dive into the details. If you're new to Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC, or just want to get a better idea of how to create apps that run on any screen size, then try out the new Quick Start guide. The Quick Start guide is a guided tutorial that takes you through all the steps needed to build an app using UI for MVC. You'll learn how to use the responsive panel, grid with scaffolding, charts, and learn how to polish your app by working with themes. To access the guide, simply visit the tutorial section of our documentation. Next, I'll show you how to get started using the new tree view scaffolding. Let's jump over to Visual Studio and see it in action. So you can see I have my project open in Visual Studio, and I've primed it with a little bit of code. In my models folder, I have a Northwind DB context. This just points to the Northwind database, and I have an employees table on that database that I want to get some data from. And I also have an employee model, and this has some properties that correspond to columns in that data table. So I want to create a view that uses a tree view and populates the hierarchy of the employees from the database. So I'm going to go over to my controllers and right click and choose New Scaffolded Item. And you can see I have a Kendo UI scaffolder in here. I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And then I have a couple widgets that I can pick from. I have an MVC grid, chart, scheduler, and tree view. I'm going to select tree view, and you might have noticed there's a Kendo UI version here as well. So what the difference is between the Kendo UI tree view and the UI for MVC tree view is if I were to choose this one, I would get the HTML and CSS version of the scaffolded view. And if I choose the UI for MVC, I will get the Razor version of the scaffolded view. I like Razor. I'm going to go ahead and choose that one, hit OK or Add. And then I'm prompted with just a few fields that I need to enter. I have the controller name. I'll just go ahead and leave that as tree view. I can name the view. I'll leave that as index. And then I'm going to select my employee model. And I am going to select the Northwind database context. And I'm going to scoot this over just a little bit so I can see my employee model. Now I'm going to take for the parent field name the reports to field. So this is going to be the field that has the ID of the parent item for the hierarchy. Now I need to fill in this has children field name, and that is going to be the field that has the relationship. So I'm going to choose employee where it has employees. Make sure I spell everything correctly in there or this won't work quite right. And then I'm going to go to this tree view options page. And then I'm just going to take the first name of the model as my text field value. So enter first name there. I'm just going to hit the enter key to go ahead and tell the scaffolder to start scaffolding. Now it's done. I have a tree view controller. Let's go ahead and look at that. Just want to show you that there's no black box. There's no smoke and mirrors on this. So what the scaffolder has done is it's created an employees read method, and that's just going to return some JSON. And what it's doing is going into the Northwind database context, and it's using Entity Framework to just select out the fields that we need to populate the tree view. And then we also have a tree view view here. I'm going to go to the index, and you can see that the Kendo UI tree view has been generated for us. It's been named, and we have our first name field here. Now, notice it calls that action employees read, and it calls it from the tree view controller. So there's no, like I said, no black box here. It's just generated some code for us, and we can freely edit this code as much as we like, and it's not going to be overwritten by any of the tooling. I'm going to go ahead and run this and see what we got. And you can see we're loading here. It's just easy as that. We've got the hierarchy of employees from the database. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the future of ASP.NET MVC. If you regularly attend our webinars, you might have seen a demo of Telerik UI for ASP.NET MVC running on Ubuntu. If you missed it, you can catch a replay of the demo on our YouTube page. This time around, I wanted to show a new feature that will change how we write views in MVC. We're going to be using the Razor tag helper. Since you can't really understand the value of tag helpers without seeing them in action, let's jump into Visual Studio and write some code. So back into Visual Studio, I have a brand new ASP.NET Core MVC project open. Now things are a little bit different in ASP.NET Core, so I saved some of the setup process to show you guys, and all I've added so far is the dependencies for Kendo UI. I'm going to go into my startup class first, and I'm going to scroll down to the configure services method, and right before add MVC, I'm going to go ahead and register a Kendo service. So I'm going to do add Kendo right here, and this is going to allow Kendo UI to build URLs and access certain variables within the system. Next, I'm going to go to my view imports file, and here's where I'm going to register my tag helpers. And you'll notice that Microsoft already has their tag helpers referenced in this file. We're just going to go ahead and add Kendo UI to that, and we're going to use the add tag helper method here, and you'll notice it takes a variable that has an asterisk in it. Now what this does is it says we're going to use all of the tag helpers available in the Kendo MVC namespace. So we could actually specify specific tag helpers that we want to use. In this case we'll just use all of them, so we'll leave that a star. So I'm going to save that. Next, I'm going to go into my index page, and here I have just kind of cleared it out, and I've left two headings here. One to input some Razor tag or some Razor helpers. This is going to be the current way that you write Razors, and then down below I'm going to show how the tag helper version of that HTML helper would look. So let's start off with a quick HTML helper here, and this is probably familiar to most of you. We're just going to go ahead and do an @html.kendo button, give the button a name, and then we have a content field here. We're just going to use hello world as our button text. So let's go ahead and format that up a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in the browser so we can see that that button is rendering correctly. So just that easy, we've got the hello world button here, it's clickable, and now things kind of get a little bit messy. So what I want to do next is I want to add a specific style to this tag help, or this Razor here, and what I mean by that is I want to add an HTML attribute to it, and I want to give it a different style. So I want to add the HTML attributes field here, and I'm going to have to declare a new anonymous object here, and I have to escape the class because class is a reserved keyword in C#, and we're going to call that kPrimary. That's going to give our button a primary color, or in this case I'm using the Nova theme from Kendo UI, so that's going to be pink. And then I'm just, for an example's sake, using a data attribute here, and notice I have to use a data underscore attribute, my attribute, and setting that to true. Now the underscore is needed because you can't use a dash in this syntax, so it's actually going to be rendered out as data dash my attribute equals true. Right, so let's go ahead and open this up in the browser real quick just to make sure everything's working correctly, and refresh the page, and there's our primary color there. Now let's go back into the code and write the tag helper version of this and see what the differences are between that and the traditional Razor. So let's open a brace just like we would for some HTML and type in Kendo. And I wanted to actually type these out so you can see the IntelliSense come up. And after I type the dash and hit enter, you can see I have a Kendo dash button, and this has all of my controls. This is what's available now. We'll have some more available later, but this is the initial batch of controls available with Razor tag helpers. And notice when I completed that button, the color in the font changed. Now this is because it's recognized what I just typed as a tag helper. So that's a little bit of IntelliSense or Visual Studio magic to help us understand what's going on. So next I'm going to go ahead and give it a name just like I did above, and notice I'm still getting IntelliSense here, and I'm going to type button, and I'm going to call this one button tag helper, And I don't have a content field here. What we actually will do is just write this like we would HTML, and we can say hello world here and hit save. And let's go ahead and render this back up in the browser and see what it looks like. Now notice I haven't given this the primary class yet. Let's go ahead and do that now. And I left this out because I wanted you to see the difference between the tag helper and just the regular Razor syntax. So let's just go ahead and do this like we would if it was HTML, and just say class and say k-primary. And we'll go ahead and add that data attribute in here as well. And notice I get IntelliSense for this if I was using one of these standard data dash attributes or something even from Angular. In this case, we just called it my attribute. And we can set that equal to true. I'm going to go ahead and save that and refresh one more time. And we should have identical set of rendering here, and we do. So if you look at the markup, there's definitely some advantages there, but you might not be wowed yet. So let's do one more demo, and then we'll move on. Let's take this button out of here, and this one, and let's try some different types of tag helpers. Now, let's do something a little more complex. Let's grab a tag helper, a Razor version of a Kendo UI window. And for that window, we need to add some content. And the content for a window control is a bit more complex than a button. So a button, we're just going to use a little text. But for a window, we want to actually have some HTML in here. And we could do that by saying at and opening up a div tag. And we could have custom HTML in here. Now, what happens if we want to add some controls in here? So if we want to have other Razor or other Kendo UI controls in here in this Razor version, now we need to do the at html.kendo date picker. And notice I've got some red lines in here, so this isn't working quite as I expected it to. So what happens is we actually have to escape this again. So we put an at in here. Notice it's still not working. We need to actually use text and open it up that way and close this again with text. And then we still have squiggly lines. So let's try that. And that seems to be working. So now we have a Kendo window and a date picker inside of that window. Let's run this and make sure we got everything correct. So let's kick this off, reload the browser here, and notice we have our window control and we have a date picker inside. So we got that correct. It's not quite as straightforward as I might have hoped. Let's see what the tag helper version of this looks like. So again, let's open up a Kendo tag. We'll use the window control. Let's give this a name. I'll call it my window 2. And we'll just open up a brace here. Now this is the content field here, so I'm just going to go ahead and add another Kendo control inside of it and say Kendo date picker and give that a name. I'll call this my date 2. And now notice I don't even have to fully close this. I can just use a self-closing tag here. And the syntax is starting to look a little more friendly to what we would consider friendly from HTML standpoint. So I'm going to go back and refresh this page, and I should get 2 windows this time. And I do. They're pretty much identical here. So we've got date pickers in both of them. We've got 2 windows. So it's a matter of preference at this point. They both do the same thing. The output is the same, but one's just a little bit clearer to understand what's going on inside of the markup. So this I can understand that this is a container object and there is an element inside of it This one you kind of get lost in translation. There's a lot of @ symbols going on here. There's this weird tag called text. So it's a little visually more appealing to have the tag helpers. So hopefully that gives you an idea what's coming up in ASP.NET Core, MVC, and what Telerik is doing to help with tag helpers. If you'd like to learn more about tag helpers and what's coming in ASP.NET Core, then visit telerik.com/whitepapers and get the free white paper, ASP.NET Core MVC, Changes Every Developer Should Know. We've been hard at work adding new documentation, features, and making UI for ASP.NET MVC future-proof. Visit telerik.com today and start your free trial. Or if you're already a current subscriber, log into your Telerik control panel and download the new updates. John, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Lots of great stuff to look forward to. To continue on with the theme of web development, I'd like to spend a few minutes here talking about Kendo UI as part of our R2 2016 release. In this release, we've implemented over 30 feature requests and closed more than 100 bugs. But this is just half of the story. Our long-term vision is that Kendo UI is and will be the default UI toolkit to build web apps. Earlier this year, we spent a lot of time building a foundation to support the future of web development, notably around Angular 2, React, and Bootstrap. This release of Kendo UI is the realization of that investment, which is why I'm incredibly excited to announce the preview of our React-based controls for Kendo UI. These are brand new jQuery-free React components, which fully utilize the virtual DOM and unidirection data flow model. This was no small task. To understand how and why we got here, I think it's important to provide some context. First, React component design has little in common with widget design through jQuery. I mention this because Kendo UI has been dependent upon jQuery since the very beginning. For React, we have to evaluate everything in terms of how we build out Kendo UI components. The same also applies to the data flow pattern, where React enforces a unidirectional model. This is especially relevant when you consider two-way data binding is the norm throughout frameworks like Kendo UI, Angular 1, and Knockout. When it came time to supporting React, we had to completely rethink the role and features of Kendo UI so that they truly integrated within the framework. To that end, we decided to explore how we can ease common development tasks like data entry forms, layout grouping, and basic user interactions, all before moving on to more complex tasks like implementing grids, schedulers, Gantt charts, and so on. So, for starters, the preview implements a simple set of controls. Controls like the button, slider, drop-down autocomplete, and so on. Now, moving forward, we'll add more as our work continues. For what it's worth, you can track this by checking out our page on GitHub. There, we have a list of components available for you to review. If you want to poke the implementations, we've published them to NPM as packages. We'll take a look at this in a demo shortly. Which brings us to Angular. React and Angular share a lot in common. For example, the use of transpilers through Babel and TypeScript, the component building block concept, and things like DOM abstractions. During the development of our React components for Kendo UI, we conducted a lot of research and built infrastructure which is common for both frameworks. Following this first release of our React components for Kendo UI will be a set of 100% pure Angular 2 based equivalents during our next release period. These components will follow the same conventions used by the React ones and will continue to build upon this foundation going forward. You can keep an eye on the Kendo Angular repository list on GitHub for more information. There you'll find a common component infrastructure which we've already released. Moving on to the UI components of Kendo UI, we have updated the editor widget to support Markdown. This is great for users wanting a simplified format for authoring text. We've also added support for auto-detecting any hyperlinks that are typed by the user. We've also added a new configuration option for the editor that enables you to pre-process clipboard contents. This is useful for formatting text during a paste operation prior to it being committed to the editor itself. The spreadsheet component was introduced in the previous release of Kendo UI, and we've already started to improve it. In this release, we've added support for links and multi-line editing to cells. We've also added the ability to control the display of grid lines. This is really useful for printing scenarios where you might want to hide them. One of my favorite parts of Kendo UI is its rich set of data visualizations. In this release, we've added a new chart type. The vertical box plot is useful for comparing distributions between different sets of numerical data. Let's take a look at these features in action. I'll start by showing you our new React components for Kendo UI. You can find these components on GitHub. Simply search for Kendo-React and you'll get a list of the ones we've implemented so far. These include our dropdowns, inputs, layouts, buttons, pop-ups, and so on. Let's drill into the input components for React. In this repo, you'll find a structure that looks like this. Here, we include the source of the components, our unit and end-to-end tests, documentation, and examples. We also have defined a set of scripts for conducting builds, running tests, and so on. To get started, let's take a look at the inputs example. I'll open up this directory in Visual Studio Code and navigate to the examples directory. Here we have two examples, one for basic usage that's dependent upon tooling, and one that's based on a CDN. The basic one provides the bare bones example of how our component is used. Now, if you've used Kendo UI with jQuery before, you'll know that we designate a DOM element as the component. The process for React is somewhat different. Here, we define a container where we'll define an input to component via a special templating language called JSX. JSX is an XML-like syntax extension for JavaScript, and it's used by a preprocessor. Scrolling to the bottom, here's our call to react-dom.render. This is the primary API used by React to render into the DOM. In this case, we're rendering a slider component for the app DOM container code you saw defined earlier. Scrolling up, we have a slider declared with its constructor and configuration properties. Here I'm defining a slider with a maximum, minimum, predefined value, and step count. These and other configuration properties are emitted via the render method for the component that you see here. Let's now see this component in action. I'll navigate over to the terminal window and execute the start task through gulp. This will process the JSX and start the Webpack dev server with browser sync in front of it. Let's now point our browser to this location and see the result. As you can see, the Kendo UI slider has been output to the screen. It works the same as the slider you know and love, except in this case, it's built on React. In fact, if we fire up the Chrome DevTools, we can see this in action. Here, I've installed the React Developer Tools, and I can see the JSX syntax for the slider itself along with its configuration. Now, because Chrome is connected via browser sync, I can start to manipulate values in the source and see the effects of those changes live. Setting the maximum value to 100, for example, will change the appearance of the slider. So to quickly recap, this is an example of the Kendo UI slider component built on React. We're utilizing JSX, we can control values, under the covers we're utilizing the virtual DOM, there's no jQuery, it's all great stuff. Let's now move on to the individual controls themselves, starting with the editor. As I mentioned, the editor now supports Markdown. On this page, I have a Kendo UI editor defined. Clicking on the View Source button, you'll notice that I can change the underlying text of the editor to use Markdown. This includes things like headers, links, bullet lists, and so on. The way this works turns out to be pretty simple. Jumping over to Visual Studio Code, here is the page for the example you just saw. You'll notice that we have a set of functions that we can define that will allow us to control the serialization process. When text is entered in the View Source window, it's deserialized by a function that I've defined here. In this case, I'm using Markdown-JS, a Markdown parser for JavaScript that's available on GitHub. Conversely, when text is taken from the editor and emitted out as Markdown, it's done through the serialization function I've written here. In this case, I'm using the HTML-MD library to serialize the underlying markup of the editor into Markdown. Overall, it's pretty easy to use, and it will allow you to control how serialization is conducted. This extensibility opens up a wide range of possibilities for the editor widget. Let's quickly jump over to the spreadsheet control. Here's one I have on a page. As you can see, I can now type across multiple lines with a cell by simply holding down the Alt key when I hit Enter. Doing so puts the cursor on a new line. I can also add a link to a cell by clicking on the Link menu button you see here. Let's go ahead and add a link to the NativeScript homepage. Now, hovering over the cell, you can see the link is there. The spreadsheet has also been updated to control grid line appearance. Specifically, I can now control their appearance through the Show Grid Lines configuration option on a sheet-by-sheet basis. If I take the same example I just showed you and update it to hide the grid lines, refreshing the page will show you a spreadsheet without grid lines. This is particularly useful when printing out spreadsheets. Moving on to data visualizations, Kendo UI has a new widget, the vertical box plot. This widget is useful for comparing distributions between different sets of numerical data. Here you can see I have data displayed in a vertical box plot. Hovering over this bar will display some of the indicators I mentioned earlier, such as lower, median, mean, and upper. As I mentioned before, this mode is particularly useful for mobile devices when held vertically or in portrait mode. I can quickly test this by switching to the simulator to see what this looks like on, say, the iPhone. As you can see, this works well in this scenario. Let's now switch gears and talk about the latest features we've added to products relating to mobile and desktop development. In particular, UI for Xamarin, UI for UWP, and UI for WPF. To take a look at this, I'd like to invite my colleague Sam Basu to tell us more about what's new in these products. Sam?
Alright, thank you, John. So as introduced before, my name is Sam Basu, one of your Telerik developer advocates covering DevTools. Where can you find me after the webinar? Simple, at SAMIDIP. That's my Twitter handle. Feel free to ping me anytime. So Ed and John talked about all things web, which is obviously very cool and modern and ubiquitous, but guess what else is hot? Mobile. Turns out, having a mobile strategy isn't a luxury anymore. Everybody is doing it, including many enterprises. At the same time, however, going mobile with your applications isn't easy. This is because you're trying to target a plethora of devices across multiple mobile platforms. So the choice of tools and technologies that you use to build your mobile applications depends squarely upon the skills you have, the maintainability of your applications, and the audience that you're trying to target. Let's talk about two major choices, and we begin with Xamarin. Now, the promise of Xamarin has been pretty clear from the get-go. You get to build your applications from the comforts of C# and your beloved IDE, that's Visual Studio. Your applications get cross-compiled down to native applications on iOS, Android, and Windows, utilizing the Mono framework. So Xamarin offers a great way to take your applications cross-platform using the skills that you already have. And using some polished UI controls from Telerik, you can really light up your applications. Now, before we move on though, I think it's fair enough to talk about some of the recent developments in the Xamarin community in the last couple of months. The big news is Xamarin has now been acquired by Microsoft. It's now one big happy family, and all of the goodness of Xamarin platform is available to you inside of Visual Studio, and it's completely free, even for VS Community editions. So you could say that Microsoft has democratized cross-platform mobile development for .NET developers. And at the recent Xamarin Evolve conference, we got to see a little bit of the future of Xamarin tools. The improvements inside of Xamarin Studio, the integrations inside of Visual Studio, the inclusion of Roslyn to power C#6 features, and the overall mobile DevOps story with Visual Studio Team Services, Hockey App, and Xamarin Insights. The simple truth is, .NET now runs on a lot of different places, and C# allows you to target any application on any platform. We completely see the lure of Xamarin for .NET developers, and we want to be right next to you in this journey, which is why we have Telerik UI for Xamarin. Our UI for Xamarin suite gets you native UI controls for your cross-platform Xamarin apps. Your professional apps need polished UI, and we are talking about hard-hitting controls like different types of charts and graphs, list views, and side drawers and gauges. These are things which take us a lot of engineering effort to build, and you really do not want to recreate these by hand. You could target Xamarin iOS or Xamarin Android, which for us are wrappers for you to render native Telerik UI controls for iOS and Android. Or you could go with Xamarin Forms, which allows you to write a single layer of abstracted UI that stretches across all platforms. Telerik UI for Xamarin is a product suite that's very near and dear to my heart, just because how productive it makes me. So, what's new in Telerik UI for Xamarin in this release? Well, we realized that Xamarin development can sometimes be complicated, so we are working hard to make the getting started experience as seamless as possible. Accordingly, there is a new Visual Studio template. There is a new project configuration wizard which makes life so much easier. And there is a new private NuGet server that allows you to get the Telerik bits from any project. One of our most popular and heavily used UI controls is the Xamarin Forms list view. this list view now gets Windows Universal support. So with the same list view and a shared code, you can easily target iOS, Android, and Windows. Let's dive in a little deeper. As I mentioned, the getting started experience gets much more easier. Here's a look at the new Visual Studio template that now ships as a part of Telerik UI for Xamarin. Here's a look at the new project configuration wizard. I'll show you these two things in just a second. And no matter what be your IDE of choice, be it Xamarin Studio on a Mac or Visual Studio on Windows, you can now point your package manager to this new private NuGet feed, nuget.telerik.com/NuGet. And therein, once you're authenticated, you'll find the bits for Telerik UI for Xamarin, ready to include in any project of your choice. So here I am on my Windows 10 machine for a quick demo. I'm inside Visual Studio 2015, and you can do the same things in VS 2013. If you have older versions of Visual Studio, you possibly need a hug. And there really isn't any reason to not upgrade. VS Community Edition is free after all. Well, granted you have Visual Studio and the Xamarin tools, you need to get the latest bits for Telerik UI for Xamarin. You can get them from Telerik.com or through the Telerik control panel. Once you have all the latest bits, you can now go File, New, Project, and inside of Visual C# templates, at the very end you'll find the Telerik WinForms app. This is the new VS template, and once you pick this, it launches you into a new wizard. This is the Project Configuration Wizard. The Project Configuration Wizard is essentially trying to get your project to a nice starting point. You get to choose the platforms that you want to target, like iOS, Android, or Windows, and even within a platform you get to choose the API levels, the target devices like iPhone or iPad or Unified, and the target OS version. These settings essentially get you the exact API canvas that you need inside of your project given the platforms that you want to target. I essentially just completed this configuration wizard in another project, so let me switch to that. So essentially, here's my app with all of the projects. You get to see WinRT, Android, iOS, the portable shared libraries, and Windows Phone libraries. Now, if you look inside any of these projects, like for example the iOS one, you'll see some very specific references to Telerik Xamarin controls, like the iOS charts, chart renderers, common, and all of these DLLs that you need, as well as some of the Xamarin core ones, like the platform iOS and XAML ones. These are again customized to the exact API canvas that you need for your chosen targeted platforms. Now, if I go look at the documentation for Telerik UI for Xamarin, for any of our controls, we kind of list out all of your dependencies. Here are the DLLs that you need in your common project, in your Android project, and your iOS project. So you get to reference all of these things by hand, and you can still do them inside of Xamarin Studio or Visual Studio. Or you could go with the new Visual Studio template and the project configuration wizard, and right out of the gate, we will set up your project with the exact DLLs and the APIs that you need for your given target platforms. Pretty neat, right? So, back in our slides, let's talk about one of the most popular controls in the Telerik UI for Xamarin suite, and that is the WinForms list view. Turns out almost every mobile app needs a polished templated UI that can bind to a collection of items. Now, the WinForms Telerik list view is not your grandma's list view. It's on steroids. It has multiple layout modes. It supports pull to refresh. You can swipe each item, and there are animations on inserts and deletes. You can bind the list view to thousands of items, and it still scrolls seamlessly, thanks to some UI virtualization and some smart on-demand data binding. Now, the WinForms list view in Telerik UI for Xamarin now has extended support into Windows Universal apps, which means you can use the same list view to target iOS, Android, and now Windows. We would extend our support to UWP apps as well as soon as Xamarin does. And eventually you'll see other controls like the data form also extend their support into Windows Universal. So essentially, you will see us keep investing a lot into Xamarin iOS, Android, as well as a lot more love into Xamarin Forms. So Xamarin is pretty hot with .NET developers, and we want to give you the most polished and comprehensive UI control suite for your Xamarin apps. Keep looking out for much more in the Telerik UI for Xamarin suite in the upcoming releases. Alright, so now let's switch gears and talk about UWP, Microsoft's Universal Windows Platform. The promise is pretty big. Write your app once and it runs on every Windows device. And if you think about it, it's pretty magical. From a single codebase, your app is now able to run on every Windows device, starting from headless IoT devices, mobile, PCs and laptops, all the way to bigger screens like Xbox and Surface Hub, and even the ultra-cool HoloLens. It's all your same .NET skill set over the same API canvas. It truly is one single Windows platform now, and we want to make sure that as you build your UWP apps, you have the most polished UI controls from Telerik to keep you company. Enter Telerik UI for UWP. So our UI for UWP suite gets you a collection of rich UI controls that simply work on every Windows 10 device adaptively, all from a single codebase. You get complicated controls like various types of charts and graphs, the list views, the grids, and different types of input controls. These are controls you really do not want to reinvent the wheel on. UWP is clearly the way forward for Microsoft developers, and we will continue investing heavily in UWP going forward. This release, however, the big news in Telerik UI for UWP comes from what I call the almighty grid. Now, something to keep in mind is you can actually use UWP and the underlying .NET Core to build desktop applications, which is particularly useful for enterprise scenarios. So complex controls like the grid need to work both for mouse and keyboard as well as for touch. And you get all these things out of the box from the Telerik UWP grid. You get features like easy grouping, sorting, filtering, and reordering, as well as custom templates for your cells. You can bind our grid to hundreds and thousands of records, and it still is buttery smooth, thanks to some smart UI virtualization. The grid also allows for easy data edits. So given a data source, your grid becomes the combined UI that both displays the data as well as gives the user the option of editing the data in multiple modes, and all of that gets written back to your data source. So we have been working on perfecting the grid for quite some time now, and this release I have two pieces of news for you. One, the grid is now optimized for phone form factors, which means the same grid is now perfectly at home on a large display like a Surface Hub or your laptop, as well as on a tiny phone screen. And yes, it reorganizes itself and is completely touch-friendly. And finally, we are taking the beta tag off the grid. It is now ready for prime time and whatever grind you put it through. Now, I will not go into the code or any other details here, but let me show you quickly how you can play around more with the grid and other UI controls that are in the Telerik UI for UWP suite. So, I'm back on my Windows desktop, and what you can do is from any Windows 10 device, you can head to the Windows Store and search for Telerik UI. That'll bring you to a sample app of the Telerik UI examples for Windows Universal. I love this app. This is a showcase app for Telerik UI for UWP. And look how nicely it is designed and how easily you can scroll around and you can play with every one of the controls that make up the UWP suite. In particular, some of the popular ones like the grid that we have been talking about. So I can go into the grid. This one, for example, is just a basic grid. But even here, you notice how nicely the UI lights up. You can have custom cell templates. You can have filtering and sorting and so on. You can go back and you can play with more advanced features of the grid like grouping, selections and data updates and so on. You can also look into something like editing, where the user gets to kind of double click on every cell and go into an edit mode. Now, at any point inside of this app, if you find something that's really nice about a control, you can simply right click and look at the code to see how we are doing it. So right here in your menu option is a code option. So once you go in there, it will show you exactly the view models and exactly what we are doing to light up the control and how it's behaving. In particular, in this case with the grid, I can go look at my XAML markup, and here's my Telerik RAD data grid that's doing it. And just the one line of code here, user edit mode of inline, that's allowing my edit mode to happen. So let me back out of this one here. So overall, we are very excited with the UWP promise. As you saw at Build Conference, your skills in building UWP apps now translate to your apps going places that it never has been. The same UWP apps can now run seamlessly on Xboxes and on HoloLenses, which is pretty incredible. So we will keep investing heavily in our UI for UWP suite and hopefully get you all the polished UI controls that you need for your apps. So back onto my slides here, and let me switch gears and talk about the desktop. The clear message that I want you guys to take home is have confidence in what you're doing. In this day and age where all you hear about is mobile first and cloud first, and if you're doing desktop development, don't feel you're alone. In fact, there are many enterprises who run billion-dollar businesses based on desktop applications. In fact, at the beginning of 2016, we did a little survey where we asked .NET developers what technology would you use to build your next desktop application. more than 80% of you guys said either WPF or WinForms, so you're in good company. So let's talk about WPF and our beloved Telerik UI for WPF suite. Our UI for You WPF suite makes me pretty proud. It's one of the most mature and richest UI control sets that we offer. And WPF apps have come a long way. They don't need to be the Battleship Grey anymore. They are modern, they are touch-friendly, they work on device kiosks and in a whole lot of other places. And a modern UI control suite like ours gives you all the ammunition to be productive in making WPF apps. You get an extensive set of controls out of the box, and every one of those controls have an intuitive API and a consistent coding paradigm. You'll be very much at home if you do any XAML development, and we support patterns like MVVM. You get professional looking themes, and every one of the controls sports exceptional performance and has built-in touch support. So here it is, a list of the 100 plus UI controls that make up our WPF suite. Just take a look around at the variety of controls, including some of the most popular controls like the grids, the charts, the spreadsheets, the maps, and so on. These are really not UI controls that you want to recreate by hand. So take a good look around, and I'm sure you will find UI controls that are just the perfect fit for your WPF apps. So, what's new in Telerik UI for WPF in this release? Well, a lot of things. To start off, there is a brand new ERP sample application. This is a classic showcase of how to build a modern WPF app using Telerik UI. I'll show you this in just a second. The RAD grid view gets a specific feature called pinned rows. You can now pin specific rows at the top or the bottom of your grid so that they do not participate in vertical scrolling. If you're using a combo box column, you should see some performance benefits as well. There is a brand new RAD layout control which makes it a breeze to organize the layout of your app and all of its child controls. I'll talk more about this. Now, our WPF suite has had Office-like document processing through what we call the RAD spread processing. And if you're loading and displaying the documents to the user, you should continue using that. But now there's a new kit. It's called the RAD spread stream processing, which might sound like a mouthful, but essentially the trick is to avoid the entire document model. So it's rendering your documents entirely in memory in a stream, which allows for blazing fast exports. Now, in this release, you will find feature improvements throughout our WPF suite, including those in the RAD rich text box, RAD schedule view, and RAD docking, as well as performance tuning in the RAD PDF viewer and RAD spreadsheet. Another interesting thing that we did was the integration of GitHub sample code in our docs. So we have GitHub repositories which show you a tremendous amount of developer-focused sample code, scenarios in how to work our controls. All of that sample code is now integrated in our docs. So as you're looking at a control and you look at something interesting, you can reuse some of that code in your applications without ever having to leave our documentation. So I'm now back on my desktop to show you a real quick demo. This is the ERP sample app that I was talking about. You can get to the sample app either from the installer for UI for WPF or from our demo site. And you can also get to the source code. This is a full-blown enterprise ERP application. You can see in my source code here in my Visual Studio, this is my client-side code and it has some of the MVVM patterns. This is my repository pattern and this is my service. And if I go ahead and run this, which I just have, this is my application. This is a true ERP type application built with Telerik UI for WPF. You can notice I can switch my themes around here. This moves me to a white theme. This one here, for example, is a RAD tree view. This whole thing is a RAD grid, and then this one here is a RAD map. So we are utilizing Telerik UI for WPF controls to build a truly enterprise ERP solution and giving you all the source code so you can look around and get some ideas to build something like this on your own. So back in our slides, let's talk about the one brand new control this release, and that is the RAD layout control. This has been one of the most highly requested features in our feedback channels, and we are finally happy to be able to offer you this control. Think of it as a parent control that allows you to organize your complex UI and compose your layouts. The nice thing is it allows automatic rearrangement and resizing. So as your WPF apps window shrinks and expands, so will the child controls that are part of this layout control. The benefits of the layout control extend to your end users as well. At runtime, your users can control the customization of the layout engine. They can resize, they can rearrange, and they can hide and show different elements that are part of that layout control. As a developer, you get true item nesting, so you can establish parent-child relationship between the controls that you're putting in your layout control, and you get intuitive drag and drop design features. As you're laying out your controls, you get various display modes like standard or tabbed or extended. Overall, I think this layout control is one of those cornerstone controls which allows you to control the organization and the layout of your entire application, all from one responsive control. So that's all I have for UI for WPF, and in fact, that's all I have for my section. So we talked about three major things today. On the mobile side of things, we talked about Xamarin and UWP, and for desktop, we talked about WPF. John is going to come on next and talk about WinForms, but hopefully what you see is our continued investments to enable you to build whatever type of application that you need, mobile or desktop. Trust us to provide you with rich and polished UI controls for all your technology stacks, so you can be productive and not have to reinvent the wheel. I'm keeping my resources pretty simple. These are the product pages for Telerik UI for Xamarin, UWP, and WPF. Start there, and that'll take you to what's new in each of the control suites, some of the controls and their features, and extensive demos. So that's all from me. I'm just going to hang around here until Q&A time, and I'm going to let John take over. So back to you, John.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. Continuing on from WPF, let's now look at what's new in UI for WinForms. WinForms, or Windows Forms, has been around for a long time. There are a lot of organizations that still use it to build solutions for the desktop. That stated, Microsoft has put the technology into maintenance mode, which means there are no new features being implemented for it. This can be frustrating for customers who have existing investments with WinForms. To support these folks, we've built the WinForms conversion tool. This tool will convert your WinForms projects and their underlying controls to Telerik UI for WinForms. We're making this available as a community technical preview, and it works through Update 2 of Visual Studio 2015. Ultimately, this gives you a go-forward path when it comes to WinForms, and it's a solution to a problem that I think our customers will really appreciate. In the latest release of UI for WinForms, we've officially shipped the RAD Virtual Grid. This is the first virtual grid on the market with hierarchy support. It handles scenarios with large amounts of data, such as millions of rows, by triggering an event when a cell needs a value, which will then query the data source and provide its value. The component also supports editing, sorting, filtering, paging, selection, busy indicators, and much more. We have also added a brand new control called the RAD Card View. This control displays data in a card format, which enables information in the card to be grouped, sorted, filtered, and edited inline and interactively. And finally, we've updated the RAD weighting bar to include 7 new weighting indicators, bringing the total number to 10. These are highly customizable weighting bar styles for your WinForms apps. Let's quickly jump into a demo of UI for WinForms. Here I have a vanilla WinForms app. It's a standard app with a set of controls that ship with Visual Studio present on the form. In this release of Telerik DevCraft, we've added a new menu option to Visual Studio that will convert this project from a WinForms project to a Telerik UI for WinForms project. Additionally, it will convert any controls present in the app over to UI for WinForms. Let's go ahead and run this. Here, I can select the version I wish to convert to. I can also select the controls I wish to move over to UI for WinForms. It's important to note the warning dialog we show down here. This tool isn't perfect, so there are some errors that can be encountered during the conversion process. The conversion will kick in and modify your project's source code. Visual Studio has detected a change to the underlying source code. Let's go ahead and accept all changes. Once the converter is finished, this dialog will appear showing me what has changed in my project. Clicking the What's Changed button will generate a diff between the old version and the converted version in my code. I can also manually inspect the conversion log as well. Now, due to time constraints, I'm going to quickly review the latest feature we've added to the remaining products found in the R2 2016 release of Telerik DevCraft. Let's start with Telerik Report Server. In this release, we've added the ability for you to define tasks to send data alerts and email notifications automatically when a specific event or predefined condition occurs. Additionally, we've added a new integration between the desktop report viewers of Telerik Reporting and Telerik Report Server. This allows you to populate your WPF or WinForms apps with reports stored in Report Server. This is a huge win for customers because it enables you to update each report remotely through Report Server without the end user having to upgrade an already installed application. Speaking of reporting, we've added a few new capabilities to Telerik Reporting itself. In our latest release, the report, table, crosstab, and graph items now support interactive sorting in a particular group when a report is loaded in interactive mode. This is supported for reports present in a report viewer or in the report designer. Before we go, I want to provide you with a sneak peek of a tool we've been working on. It's called Just Assembly, and it's a .NET assembly diff and analysis tool. With it, you can quickly decompile .NET assemblies and perform binary code diffs against them, all within a single interface. Anyways, I thought that would be fun just to show off. Now, if you didn't happen to hear or read about the latest release of UI for NativeScript that we recently announced, I'd encourage you to check it out. In fact, we have a webinar coming up on May 17th that you can register for to hear more about what we've built. Well, that about wraps it up for the R2 2016 webinar for Telerik DevCraft. If you'd like to find out more about Telerik DevCraft, please go visit our website. As a reminder, don't forget to look for the webinar recap and follow-up Q&A that we'll publish to our blogs. And finally, developer.telerik.com should be your homepage for all things Telerik. Here, you'll find informative articles, community resources, and more, all featuring folks from the developer relations team and developers like you in the community. Once again, my name is John Bristow, and along with Sam Basu and Ed Charbonneau, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us for the R2 2016 release webinar of Telerik DevCraft.